This is an original first-generation Lincoln Navigator, and it is the first full-size luxury SUV. I mean it. This car may not look too impressive by modern standards, but it came out 20 years ago, and it was the beginning of the full-size luxury SUV. And today I've tracked down this excellent example of an original Navigator to show you what the full-size luxury SUV looked like back when this started it all. First, a little overview. I've borrowed this Navigator from a viewer here in the Los Angeles area, and it really was the first big luxury SUV. Back when the Navigator first came out, there were only two other large luxury SUVs on the market, the Range Rover and the Lexus LX, and both of those were pitched as off-roader capable, go-anywhere vehicles that just happened to be luxurious, as opposed to a luxury family vehicle for the suburbs. The Jeep Grand Wagoneer had been on the market earlier, but it was canceled about 10 years before the Navigator came out, and it was replaced with a unibody crossover, the Grand Cherokee, because Jeep didn't see a market for full-size luxury SUVs like this. And then the Lincoln Navigator went on sale. It was the result of perfect timing and a brilliant decision from Ford. We think people will buy a luxury version of our full-size Ford Expedition SUV. We don't know, of course, but we think. So they took the risk and they brought this out, and of course in the ensuing years everyone has copied them. The year after the Navigator came out, Cadillac debuted the Escalade. The Lexus LX has morphed from an off-roader to a more suburb-focused family luxury SUV like the Navigator. And then many other full-size luxury SUVs came out, the Mercedes-Benz GL, the Infiniti QX80, the BMW X7, the GMC Yukon Denali, the Audi Q7, and others. And it all started right here. And it's amazing to see what the start of the big luxury SUV looks like. The first-gen Navigator came with only one engine, a 5.4-liter V8 that started off at 230 horsepower and then grew to 260 and then to 300. By modern standards, it isn't all that luxurious, but back in 1998, this was the king of the hill. It was the star of every rap video. Everybody wanted one. Every entertainer and athlete had one of these. So today I'm going to show you around the first Lincoln Navigator, the beginning of the big luxury SUV as we know it, and I'm going to show you all of its quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the original Navigator, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of the best preserved old school luxury SUVs currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. I'm going to start the quirks and features on the outside of the original Navigator with a few interesting features Lincoln added to distinguish this car from the lesser Ford Expedition. Starting with the door handles, you don't get painted door handles, you have nice chrome door handles because this is a luxury vehicle. Also on the front door, I love the fact that it doesn't just say Navigator, but it has a little globe logo next to Navigator, since you were navigating the globe in your Navigator. I guess that little logo was intended to show how worldly and capable the Navigator was. One of my favorite Navigator exterior changes, however, is right here. Now, the Navigator shared this window with the Ford Expedition, but while the Expedition had just a window, the Navigator had this black piece of plastic placed on the front part of the window with the Lincoln badge and with some fake vents to distinguish this from its lesser Ford version. I wonder who at Ford came up with that. How do we make it more luxurious? I've got it! Let's put a plastic piece over part of the rear window. Now, next up, another interesting feature on the outside of the Navigator is the running boards. One interesting item with these running boards, they're lighted. Lincoln wanted entry and exit to be as easy as getting into a car, so not only is the running board there to help you step in, but they're lit so that at night you can see where you step to climb into your Navigator. Another interesting item on the outside of the Navigator is that the mirrors are heated. Not all that uncommon for luxury cars. The interesting thing is that it says on the mirrors, heated. And it doesn't just say that they're heated, it says it in a nice little luxury script, bringing a fine, luxurious feel to the label that tells you that your power mirrors are heated. Next up, moving on to the headlights, it's hard to imagine there was ever a time when expensive, big, full-size luxury SUVs didn't have xenon headlights or LEDs, but indeed, the late 90s, none of them did. Lincoln did, however, find a way to make their headlight cluster classy and unique. You can see they inserted the Lincoln logo in there into the headlight so that you knew if you stared into the headlight that you weren't looking at an imposter. But anyway, now we're inside the Navigator, and it is quite an interesting experience in here. First off, just take a look around. This is a very, very different vehicle than the new Navigator. The new Navigator with its beautiful, brilliant interior, 22-way power seats, giant screens, all the finest materials absolutely everywhere. I reviewed the new Navigator, and I'm going to link that in the description below, and you should go watch it and kind of compare how different these vehicles are. It is absolutely beautiful. And then you climb into this vehicle, and it's completely different. It's amazing how big the panel gaps are just about everywhere in this interior. There's no big screen. The dashboard doesn't have that really nice, swoopy, futuristic look to it. It's a very old school vehicle, and it's hard to believe that this was the pinnacle of luxury when it came out 20 years ago. But I promise you that it was. This was the nicest, the most luxurious, and one of the most desirable vehicles on the market back in the late 1990s. It's just that our tastes and our standards have changed so much since then. A few examples of that. Take a look at this steering wheel, this old school two-spoke steering wheel. You'd never see that in a modern luxury SUV today. But again, this was the most desirable vehicle of its era, and it used that, and it was totally fine. And then you have the door handle. The interior door handle is just this little curved plastic piece that would never fly in a modern top-end luxury SUV. It's just amazing how much consumer tastes have evolved and changed since this vehicle came out. But with that said, this vehicle did have some cool luxury quirks and features, and I'm going to show them to you now, starting with power adjustable pedals. There's a little switch over to the left of the steering wheel. You can press it to move the pedals forward or backwards. That's an amazing feature for 1998. I think this is one of the very first vehicles to have it. The idea here was that the Navigator was expanding the demographics for who would be driving a full-size truck. No longer was it just farmers and ranchers who'd be using it to go drive out somewhere on their land and fix a fence. Instead, it would be used to haul families around the suburbs. And so the power pedals made it easier for the pedals to come closer to the driver's seat so a wider size range of drivers could drive the vehicle. And you can see in Lincoln's owner's manual explaining the power pedals, there's a picture of a woman's heeled shoe there. That was their thinking. They didn't want smaller women who would be driving the Navigator to have to sit too close to the steering wheel and thus risk injury from the airbag in the event of an accident. Now, next up with the steering wheel, it has a rather interesting feature. You can control the climate controls from the steering wheel. Check this out. In most luxury vehicles, you can control the cruise control from the wheel, the radio, the gauge cluster screen, but in this one, there are buttons to adjust the climate control temperature and the fan speed on the steering wheel. That is not something you see very often, but it's a brilliant idea, and I don't know why more automakers don't implement it. If Lincoln had it 20 years ago, it should be standard in way more luxury cars. Now, speaking of the climate controls, this vehicle has an abundance of them. You already have seen the climate controls on the steering wheel, and then there is a set of climate controls in the center control stack, like in most cars. There's also a set of climate controls in the overhead center console above the rear view mirror. These are the rear seat climate controls. They work in kind of an unusual manner. If you turn the dial on the left to rear, then the rear passengers have control and they can do whatever they want with their climate controls. But if you turn it to anything else, then you are controlling the rear seat climate controls, and your rear passengers will just have to deal with whatever it is that you've selected. And then, of course, there is another group of climate controls in the rear overhead center console so that the rear seat passengers can make their controls. Now, speaking of the rear climate controls, here's a little Easter egg with the Navigator. The rear climate vents are mounted on the ceiling in back. And so if you don't have any rear passengers who need their climate controls, you, the front passenger, can adjust the vent so it's pointing on the back of your head, giving you extra airflow for when you need it on a hot day to cool down or a cool day to warm up. It's an interesting little trick of the rear climate vents in the Navigator. And one other interesting item with the climate controls, in most cars, there are little diagrams that show you where the air will be coming out and you can select them. In this car, it's printed. Panel floor is panel floor, that's the instrument panel on the floor, or you can press floor and just have them coming out on the floor. And floor def is the floor and the defroster, and you can choose between all of those items. It's odd not to see little depictions of those things, but that's what they chose to do in the Navigator. Next up, moving on to the stereo, the Navigator has a rather interesting feature with the stereo, namely you can select the type of music experience you want to have. You press this little select button up or down, and you can choose between a jazz club, a hall, I guess just a hall, I don't really know what that means, a church, a stadium, or my favorite, news. So if you want your music to sound like news, you can select the news function and then it will. Now, I found hall to be so weird and vague that I went and looked it up in the owner's manual, and it turns out they describe hall specifically as a rectangular concert hall with a 2,000 seat capacity, not 1,000. Not 3,000. They've narrowed it down, and that setting sounds just like that. This was the forefront of music technology back in the late 90s. Another interesting item with the stereo is a feature that Lincoln calls selective lighting. And this is described in the owner's manual as a feature where if you're listening, for example, to the CD player, then only the buttons for the CD player will be lit up on the stereo. So I guess you're not given too much bright lighting at once from the stereo, and only a selective lighting sample is displayed. Very unusual. Next up, I want to move on to the center console, and I want to start with the center console lid, and you can see this nice stitching going down the center of it. Stitching like this has become very common in luxury cars, but it wasn't back in the late 90s. This was probably considered a huge, luxurious upgrade from the Ford Expedition center console lid. And next up, moving on from the center console, in front of the center console, you have the cup holders. They're pretty standard, normal cup holders. Nothing particularly interesting about them, except they aren't the only cup holders in the front of this car. There's a little plastic panel underneath the center control stack that says push. You push it, and then more cup holders are revealed, although these are very small cup holders, and you can see that printed on them it says soft cups only. Do not try and place your hard cups in this cup holder. That is not what it is meant for. Next up, a few interesting storage items in this car. One is in the center, between the center control stack and the cup holders, you have a large empty space here, and so Lincoln decided to make it a large empty storage space, and you can stick stuff in it. Later, they offered a navigation system for this car, one of the earliest on-screen in-car navigation systems, which was absolutely terrible. I think you would rather have the storage hole. And speaking of the driver's area, I want to talk seats. This car has obviously nice leather seats with the Lincoln logo stitched into them, and they are 8-way power seats, which was a pretty luxurious touch back then. One interesting item, though, is the backrest is not power. It is manually adjustable with this lever. I don't know why Lincoln decided to stop the power seats at the backrest and give you 8 ways to move around the rest of the seat, but for whatever reason, they did. Next up, I want to talk about the overhead center console. It has a screen of its own, and it shows the direction you're traveling, and it will also show your fuel range to empty, and you can easily switch it between miles and kilometers. It also shows your fuel economy, and you can see it's pretty atrocious. This vehicle does not get the best gas mileage, and it was not designed to. That was probably the very last thing on the mind of Ford and Lincoln designers when they were creating this giant full-size V8 luxury SUV 20 years ago. Another interesting item in the overhead center console, you look up here and you can see there are 2 switches marked vent. So what do? Well, you press them and they open up the rear windows for the 3rd row of seats. They open them just an inch. The 3rd row occupants don't get to roll down their windows, but they do get to enjoy just a little bit of air from the vent windows that the front seat occupants control. Next up, I want to mention one other interesting item with this car, and that would be the trim, and specifically the wood trim. Now, this car came from the factory with some wood trim touches, like on the steering wheel and over on the side of the dashboard next to the airbag, but it also has some accessory wood trim. Now, this would have been installed by a dealership probably back in the late 90s when it first came out to try to make a little extra money, since people who were buying this car were willing to pay whatever they had to in order to get one. And so there's this extra wood trim that probably meant more profit for the original dealer. It's the same story with the wheels. This Navigator does not have the original wheels, but it does have sort of special different wheels that were almost surely installed in the period, probably by the original Lincoln dealer who told their customer, oh yeah, these are nicer, fancier wheels, and oh, by the way, they're $2,000 extra. Next, I want to move into the glove box. I want to talk about the owner's manual. There's nothing particularly unusual or weird in here, except on page 3, there's a section entitled Using This Vehicle as an Ambulance. And there's only one item in that section. It says, do not use this vehicle as an ambulance. Great part of the owner's manual, worth the read. Thank you very much, Lincoln. Next, I want to move on to the back seat of the original Navigator. There are a few interesting items in here. I'm going to start with the fact that this rear seat is split, not 50-50, but you have one seat that folds on its own, and then these two fold together. Now, the reason for that was this seat folded to allow easier access to the third row. You can see there are 3 levers over on the side of this seat marked 1, 2, and A. A was intended, I guess, to just fold the seat flat, but 1 and 2 were to be used if you wanted to access the rear seat. You could fold it forward to make it easier to get in the back. Now, unfortunately, I can't climb into the third row of this Navigator to amuse you all, and that's because the third row is gone. It was lost to time somewhere in the last 20 years, but it did have one, which meant that you could transport your whole family in a 3-row vehicle that wasn't a minivan, that wasn't a Tahoe, that was a full-size luxury SUV, which was a huge deal back then. Now, next up, I want to move under the hood, and I want to start with just getting under the hood. The release for it is in the same place as every car. It's just a latch you pull in the driver's footwell. But when you get into this position, it's a little bit strange. That's because the hood latch isn't in the center. Instead, it's over here by the passenger side headlight. The theory is that if you have the hood latch in the center, you get your hands dirty when you open it with all the grease and grime and oil and whatever accumulates by the grill in the middle. But if you have it over here, you can open up the hood without getting your hands dirty at all. So then you open up the hood and you gaze at the glory of the 5.4-liter Intech V8. There's nothing particularly interesting or weird or quirky or unusual under the hood, but it is amazing to think about the fact that this car, when it first came out, had a 5.4-liter V8 that made 230 horsepower, whereas the new Navigator has a turbo V6 that makes double that. Now, next up, moving on to the back of the Navigator, a couple of interesting things back here, starting with simply opening up the tailgate. You can open the glass separately from the tailgate in this car, and there are little words printed on either side of the license plate. One side says glass and the other says door, and there are 2 separate handles on either corresponding side for whichever one you want to open. Now, this is brilliant because if you want to just throw some small item in the back, then you don't have to open up the entire giant heavy rear tailgate. You can just open up the rear glass and throw it in, and I wish more automakers would do this. But anyway, opening up the tailgate, there are a couple of interesting items worth mentioning. One is just how massively heavy it is, and it's not power operated. This is very different from the tailgates of the modern era. Now, this is where the third row seat would go, obviously, and you can see some of the benefits that it would have. Namely, there are rear climate vents for the third row and specific cup holders just for the third row passengers. The third row seat was not a fold flat seat like it is in modern vehicles. You could fold it down, but if you wanted all of the space in your cargo area, you would have to remove the third row, which of course was incredibly heavy. This car existed in the days before fold flat seats and ultra convenient packaging like so many minivans and full-size SUVs have now. Now, one other interesting item worth noting with the tailgate is the fact that you can see on the back of the tailgate that it says that this vehicle has the Intech V8. You might be thinking, well, why did they name the engine and put it on the back of the car. Ah, well, this was the period when Cadillac had the North Star V8, and I guess Lincoln wanted to compete, and so they developed this engine called the Intech V8, which went into the Navigator and a few other Lincoln models, and they wanted to try to sell it as cool and special and different, just like how Cadillac was marketing the North Star. And so those are the quirks and features of the original big luxury SUV, the first Lincoln Navigator. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the rad Lincoln Navigator. First impression, this thing feels just as big and it has as much presence basically as the Navigator of today. It's actually kind of interesting. It still feels like you're the king of the road and you own the world. You would think the older one may be smaller, maybe it just doesn't have that feel to it, but no, it still does. The ride is nice and comfy, surprisingly quiet in here. I think that's the biggest surprise so far. You can hear the engine, big 5.4 liter V8. Sound deadening wasn't quite what it is today, but the ride, the wind noise, stuff like that, surprisingly contained. Don't hear the tires. Steering is real light, vague. That was the intent, obviously. It's a luxury car. There was no intent for this thing to be sporty like there is in so many luxury SUVs now. This was supposed to be of size for the family and a nice ride and a cool brand name Lincoln Navigator. Now this particular Navigator is actually a 99 model and it has the larger engine. It was up to 300 horsepower by the end of the 99 model year. I can't imagine what a 230 horsepower version must have felt like. It's no surprise there was huge instant demand for additional power, and of course Lincoln provided it. All right, I'm gonna step on it here. It does feel a little bit quicker than I expected, especially high in the rev range. Of course, this is only a 4-speed automatic, so you don't get high in the rev range all that often. But passing power is more reasonable than I suspected. This is a relatively heavy vehicle, especially for only 230 horsepower. Those must have felt dog slow. With more power, it doesn't feel as bad. And I'm surprised at how modern the driving experience feels. Obviously, you look down and you see the radio and you see the climate controls and the steering wheel, and you know you're not in a brand new vehicle anymore. The column shift automatic. The steering is light, but it's totally doable. You know, this isn't like a 70s or 80s car, like an 80s town car where you turn the wheel and nothing happens for like 30 seconds. It just feels like a, fairly normal luxury SUV. And so that's the original Lincoln Navigator. I recently reviewed the new Lincoln Navigator, and it's amazing to see how far the Navigator has come in the last 20 years, and how far all luxury SUVs have come as consumer tastes have made the big luxury SUV market far more competitive. Whether or not you like big luxury SUVs, the Lincoln Navigator was the beginning of a car trend that has exploded in the last 20 years, and it's amazing to see where it all began. And now it's time to give this car a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Navigator was fine, but it looks dated today, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Acceleration, while acceptable for the time, is slow by modern standards, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is ponderous, and steering is light, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Fun factor is low. There's not much fun aside from that king-of-the-road feeling, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Cool factor is okay. These are cool in the sense that a Lincoln Navigator still has good street cred, regardless of age, and it gets a 3 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 11 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's low on virtually all relevant technology, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is good, not amazing, but excellent, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is decent, reliability is good, and the interior is okay, but not great, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is high. These are huge, and they have a lot of space, though fuel economy is a nightmare, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are a cheap way to get a big, practical luxury SUV. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 31 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 42 out of 100, which places it here against a few somewhat similar cars. The old school Navigator is one of my favorites because it really kicked off a segment, but obviously modern versions do things a lot better.